everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Bonni Cohen, Pedro Kos, and Jon Shenk, directors of the White House Effect. Thank you all so much for joining me.
Thanks for having
Thanks,
us.
Brittany. Good to be here.
It is good to have you. The White House Effect is characterized as showing the origin story of what's now described as climate change. So, to start off the conversation, why did you think now was the time to go back to square one and really tell this story from the beginning?
Pedro, John, and I have done a lot of work in the climate film space, and we have collaborated on wonderful films. And we were talking just before during the pandemic about what could be done, what could be done next, what's really needed so that we could better, as Americans, understand how we got where we are now, where there's this political divide over what is seemingly just a scientific issue, right, that we can all agree on. And we discovered that back in the late 80s, there was this moment during the Bush senior administration when the science was in, there was political will. In other words, there was a Republican candidate running on behalf of the environment as an environmental candidate, and the American people were open to hearing and listening to that and thinking about what sacrifices might need to be made to help solve it. And we thought, oh, that would be, that would be so interesting to go back and find this historical capsule of time where we could look at a moment in American history when the climate crisis was not a political issue. And that felt like an opportunity. And so we started, I'll let the others continue with the story, but that was kind of like the origin story of our getting to the origin story.
So we set about making an all archival film. We're documentary filmmakers, and it was all we could do, but we did not pick up a camera or a microphone for this film. We went back and we collected thousands and thousands of archival pieces, and we let kind of history play out in real time. It's almost like watching a political thriller when you watch this film, because you're watching things as they come out in the news, as they're recorded in the Oval Office. We went to the Bush Senior Library and found footage that had never been released to the public. We went to the archives of Exxon and found old reels that had never been transferred to digital. It really is a special film in that regard. And what you see is this kind of time lapse in history where you watch a character drama play out where President George Herbert Walker Bush in the center with an angel on one shoulder, his EPA administrator Bill Riley and his chief of staff on the other, trying to convince him to do kind of the right thing for the environment, and one trying to convince him that it'll be terrible for the American economy if he does so. There is a piece of tape that we found where the title comes from in 1988, where George Bush says to the American public, "I am the Republican environmental candidate. If you are afraid of the greenhouse effect, just you've forgotten about the White House effect. When I get into office, I will solve the greenhouse effect. It's not a conservative issue. It's not a liberal issue. It's an issue for all of humanity." And that really kind of is the essence of of where the film comes from.
Exactly. And I'll just add that one of the fascinating things about, as John said, like fast forwarding through time is not only the political drama, but it's seeing the evolution of the American public. Um, in a way that we go from 1988, when the science was not politicized, it was not a political issue, to the point that we're radio hosts in Iowa were calling it a mom and pop issue. It's an apple pie issue that everyone wanted. That'll be there'll be no difficulty in getting for the president to get behind. Um, to Everyone wanted to tackle this. Everyone wanted to solve the greenhouse effect. And that's 1988, and just 4 years later, you have a population that is completely split and divided. And we were really fascinated by that, and we wanted to understand why, how we got there, right? And so a lot of the journey of the film and our kind of North Star was sort of not only understanding the behind the scenes of the politics, but how the evolution of the American public, the public opinion evolved.
And I think that's really interesting because when you saw interviews, like man on the street interviews with Americans before, you could see that there was this agreement. Hey, we should be protecting the environment. Hey, the greenhouse effect is scary. Then you see just a few years later, there was one interview with a woman. I think she called it something to the effect of her words, a liberal commie issue or something like
Hmm.
that. And I wanted to talk about where and when you can put a finger on when exactly this went political because climate change, protecting the environment, even saying global warming now today is a politically charged, could be politically charged, and is partisan, but it wasn't always like that. I want to talk about some things that in 1988, then Vice President George H.W. Bush said. He said that global warming could and must be solved, and it's not a quote, liberal or conservative thing we're talking about. So, talk to us if you could point a finger on when exactly this went political. Where would you say it went sideways?
Well, part of the drama of the film is that you watch Bush Sr.'s Chief of Staff, Jon Sununu, sort of take control of this issue inside the White House. Tom Brokaw from NBC at one point sort of asks him flat out, are you running this? Are you the guy running this in the White House? And he had the ear of the oil industry and he had the ear of President George Bush. And he was consistently pushing out messaging around the issue of climate change. He called it un-American. He called it an uneconomic choice, having to make sacrifices that we wouldn't want to make as Americans. So, and that sort of that messaging, he sort of used certain mouthpieces, what were kind of the birthplaces of the propaganda machines that took over American radio and television, the Rush Limbaughs as an example, he sort of pushed that messaging out to them, and then that fed into the American public. And one of the things that we try and do in the film is show that feeding process, how we went from sort of just information going out to information now being mixed with disinformation or slash propaganda. And as you see that disinformation seep out, public opinion starts to change and the American people start to get confused. And all of a sudden, there's an opportunity for it to become a political issue.
And to that point, in the documentary, you really see the EPA administrator at the time, William Riley, kind of hamstrung, especially by the White House Chief of Staff, Jon Sununu. You highlighted in there an article that was written at the time in 1990. The headline was, "Whose environment czar, EPA's chief or Sununu?" And there was that real question there because they had different perspectives of where exactly the environment was going or where they wanted that messaging to be, where they wanted that policy to be. And it seemed like where it went was they were pitting environmental policy against economic policy. You could only choose one or the other. So, my next question to you, John, is do you think we still see that today?
Well, yes and no. I mean, absolutely. What you see in the film is the origin of what you might call the fossil fuel industry writ large, kind of start to take over the politics of this issue and turn it into a political issue, which we now live in that world where one party, you literally, it's been made in the current administration impossible to even mention the words climate change in government documents. So clearly we know where the Republican Party is on that issue. Um, the 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 thing that we don't remember as Americans is that there was a moment where it could have gone the other way, and you see that in the film. We are now living, fortunately, in a time where there really is an economic giant upside to making the switch to what you might call alternative energy. Really, it's the energy of choice for much of the world right now. Most of the new electricity created in the world is being done without the use of fossil fuels. And I'm personally afraid that the United States is going to get left behind economically because we're choosing to stay with these kind of, old, dirty technologies that are not just polluting the planet and making human life more difficult on the planet, but also more and more difficult economically as well.
And I think when I was viewing this documentary, it was interesting to see all of this footage, this archival footage of a Republican vice president also running to be president soon after he was elected. And he's saying, as a candidate, I am the environmental president. I will be the environmental president because it's almost unimaginable today to see a Republican or even imagine a Republican running as an
Right.
environmental president. So, but if you think about George H.W. Bush, he's this Northeast transplant. He moves to Texas. He makes his fortune in the oil industry. Now he's saying, I'm the environmental president. And he's president at a time when there are a lot of questions about the environment and climate change and things like that. There's a lot of media attention, scrutiny on oil industries. Pedro, what do you make of his leadership when you're sifting through all of this archival footage? And where do you think was his biggest misstep, perhaps?
Well, I think one of the things that really surprised us, I think, was how actually, even though George H.W. Bush was a former oil man, he did have that background, but how actually he I think he was really open to it. I think we did see in a document that we found in an extraordinary treasure trove at the Bush Presidential Library, and documents and footage that had never been seen or published before. And one of the things that we see was that the willingness and the openness that uh, President Bush had to actually tackling this head on. He very much respected Secretary EPA Administrator Bill Riley. Um, and he does say in documents, let's tackle this. Let's try to do something about it. And I think as the it really was um, there was an industry there was becoming very concerned. The fossil fuel industry was becoming very concerned, and it was a very massive lobbying effort on their behalf, uh, going straight to Jon Shenk, who was had exerted an extraordinary amount of influence, as we actually saw in the documents that we uncovered at the Bush Library, and he really intervened very much in a very active way, appointing under much, literally trying to undermine um, uh, Administrator Riley, to the point where he is being, as Bonnie said, he's being questioned in public television about being the czar, like he's the one setting policy. And he begins to kind of take on, Sununu begins to take on the fossil fuel industry talking points. And we also saw the other thing is to say one of the it's just the most mind-blowing things was the documentations from the fossil fuel industry of the strategies. It was a very clear-cut strategy. It was not
Mhm.
sort of like, oh, it all of a sudden appear. It was a very strategic way of how the narrative was subverted. They planned it out, and we saw it in multiple and multiple documents from the fossil fuel industry. And by the way, the same industry that whose scientists were confirming in the 1980s that this was happening, and they were echoing all the scientists who were saying this is going to be a problem. So I think in terms of the Bush presidency, I was shocked of how much of a chance we actually had because he was very open to President Bush was very open to taking action.
And that chance really, obviously, it seemed like a opening window, and that window was slowly closing. And I think that was one of the most surprising parts of the documentary, right? Seeing those internal documents from Exxon. I have notes about them. The Exxon really seemed concerned about the calls for action, the media attention when it came to protecting the environment, people talking about climate change. Bonnie, when you got your hands on those internal documents, I mean, what were you thinking?
I mean, the idea that we had access to an internal conversation inside the Oval Office was just so incredible to us. And I mean, we work in a visual medium, so we had to figure out ways to, both with the archival footage and these memos, bring that to life in a way that felt like a scene, and so we really made the documents a character in the movie. We had them in conversation with each other. You sort of, as a viewer, expect to come back to them. And we were shocked by what we found out about George Bush in those memos, how open he was, how much he was pushing the climate agenda, how he wanted an international conference on climate change. And also, I just was recently talking to Bill Riley on the phone, and he said the most surprising thing to him was how the way in which Sununu spoke to Bush in those documents. That the way that he was speaking to a sitting president with sort of a lack of respect, telling him what to do in a way that felt like something new for the guy who was the EPA director at the time. So I thought I think that's really interesting, and I'm very glad that the documents play such a main character in our movie because they really advanced the plot. They advanced George Bush's character in a way that we couldn't do any other way.
And to that point, now it doesn't seem like there's that much common ground on this. I mean, I cover all types of news, and if I ever do a story on a heat wave, you'll go into the comments, and in the comments, you see a lot of people saying, This is dramatized. It's the summer. What do you expect? It's supposed to be hot."
It
That wasn't
happens every year like this. Yeah.
exactly, but that wasn't the case in 1988, which is when the documentary started, because that summer was a scorcher. There were heat waves all over the country, and people really started to begin to ask questions about climate change, about the greenhouse effect, about the environment at large. And I think, John, you highlighted this quote, but I want to read it again because I think it's pivotal. Pivotal. It's in 1988, presidential election, then Vice President, Republican George H.W. Bush. This is what he said. "Those who think we are powerless to do anything about this greenhouse effect are forgetting about the White House effect. And as president, I intend to do something about it." Obviously, this quote stuck out to all of you because the documentary is called The White House Effect. So, what do you think George H.W. Bush meant then about the White House effect? And now looking back over 35 years later, what do you think the White House effect is?
Well, the, I think that what we didn't know going into this process before we made this film is what George H.W. Bush really thought. I think actually, even historians who study this much more than we had didn't know exactly what he thought. Like you pointed out, he's an oil man from Texas. His family fortune was largely made in the oil industry. History would suggest that he might have been lying at that point or maybe being disingenuous at that moment. But it turns out by studying the footage and the archive, and also, as Bonnie said, the documents around this issue, it turns out that Bush actually seemed convinced that the right thing to do, both politically and for the country and for the world, was to get on the right side of this and to back the science and create government policy that would put us on track to solving the quote unquote greenhouse effect. Um, what he was convinced of by Sununu was that it would have been politically unwise and that he would have lost the support of the fossil fuel industry, that the Americans could easily be convinced that this was not an important thing to get behind. And I think what we're living with today is the consequences of that. The film has this amazing benefit, which is to speed up this giant piece of time that happened from the time we first successfully drilled for oil in the late 1800s to 2025, where we're living today. And you kind of watch this amazing time lapse in the film happen. And what you see is the consequence of our decisions. We Americans, as voters, what our votes did. And we voted for a guy who seemed like he was going to do the right thing, and he ended up doing, in our view of history, the wrong thing. And we see right now in America where we have the majority of Americans who voted for a guy who they thought could help the country. And it seems like, from our point of view, it's actually having a major detriment to our policy on this issue that, in our minds, could not be of more importance.
And Pedro, I want to turn to you. When you're looking at the White House effect, when you're looking at that quote, if there were other actions that President George H.W. Bush took, where do you think we would be today?
One of the things, instead, I think I actually want to say, one of the things that I think is really powerful, the reason why the film, in a way, ends in 1992 is because we amassed like an archive of over 14,000 pieces of archive, and dating back to 1859 to the present. And the reason why we stopped in 1992 is because we hit Groundhog Day then. It hasn't, like the dialogue, something to realize, the dialogue has not moved significantly since then. If you look at like post 92, like
Mm.
we did Rio and then we covered Kyoto and then like with, some nuanced changes, it's very, very similar. And it's very, very similar to what we're still hearing today. And that is why we basically said like, well, that's where the story ends because we haven't really moved. It hasn't really changed the dialogue. The science has, like the science has evolved, but it's just confirming everything that we already know. We're already living through the effects of what the scientists in the 80s predicted to the T. I mean, we are living through that. And so I think we're now at another what if moment, right? And um, we can choose to repeat the history and make the same mistakes, but we can also, I think one of the things that is so powerful about I think the materials and the story that we've uncovered is that we actually, and going back to the title, is that we have the agency. This is a film about choice. It's a film about our own choice as American citizens, as citizens of the world. And when faced with the truth that is self-evident, whether we like it or not, um, we hold that key in our hands. And so I think that is like we're at another what if moment. It's like how we're going to act about it.
Mhm.
And that's kind of the question that I pose back to all of us.
And I think that that's a really interesting point because the conversations between, like we've been talking about, those man on the street interviews in 1988, they seemed more progressive than the conversations that were
Right.
highlighted in 1992 and beyond because there were headlines like things about the climate change, is this all just hot air? And I think that you would see something similar to that today. Some of those conversations you highlighted Rush Limbaugh and others, those conversations are still happening today. I mean, what do you think then it's going to take to kind of get out of this Groundhog Day, like you said, from 1992 and really make significant steps forward? And that'll be my last question that I pose to each of you.
I mean, I would just say that we have had an administration in very recent past that made a lot of progress on the climate in terms of the bill passed to move alternative energy ahead. The infrastructure bill is what I'm referring to in the Biden administration. It's not like we've always, ignored what's possible. We actually did, people say what they will about the Biden administration or whatever, but that infrastructure bill really, in terms of the climate and the environment, was a huge leap forward. So that's one thing I will say. Like, let's call that what it is. But I also think that we've had the experience of watching this film with a lot of younger people, college students, younger 20s, et cetera, and who knew nothing of this history really. I mean, of course they knew about the Bush senior administration, but not this portion of it. And frankly, I needed a refresher on it, having lived through it. And the responses are really interesting. There's a lot of rage at what could have been because many of them, most of them didn't know that there had been this time when there was this opening and willingness to make change and do things differently, and that there was a time when this issue was a non-political issue. So we as artists sort of feel emboldened by that rage in young viewers because they can take that, and as Pedro was saying, they have agency, and then they can go out and vote, and hopefully get back to a place where we actually can continue making significant change. It's, these scientists have been beating a drum for a very, very long time, and they continue to. They are the great hope in this film, honestly. The way that they continue to work and discover and innovate around this science, and continue to bring us factual realities. So if they can do it, we can do it, and hopefully we can get back to a place where we have a government that's open to this kind of change.
We're living at a time of enormous possibility. You know, the current administration and current American government is choosing to kind of put their thumb on the scale to keep businesses that are wanting to innovate in America from doing that work. In a way, we were in a Groundhog Day from 1992 until the Inflation Reduction Act was passed. And actually, Groundhog Day ended for a moment. I think pretty much American industry and American business got on with the idea that we were going to solve this and we were going to be American about it. We were going to use our brains and our creativity and our business innovation and all the entrepreneurial spirit that built this country was going to help get us out of this mess that we've gotten ourselves in. And we've taken a giant backslide, but that doesn't mean that we can't get back to that place. This country is amazing. We've created so much business innovation and scientific breakthrough, and look at the world that we've helped create. And there's just no question we can get back there. The film is really intended to remind Americans of that no matter what walk of life you're from, if you're an artist, if you're a storyteller, if you're a business innovator, if you're an entrepreneur, if you're a politician, if you're a journalist, whoever you might be, there's a place for you to tell the story and to be part of the change that we need. And that's really what we wanted to do with this film, is kind of remind people of that.
Exactly. And and I think it's becoming more and more self-evident that the false binary, right?
Mm.
That like you're either for the environment or you're for for the economy and for America. That's actually a completely false binary. That is not the choice, especially now where the technological advances that we've seen over the past 30 to 40 years have been extraordinary in that front. So I think we're beginning to awaken, but the awakening is not happening overnight, but we're awakening to the fact that
Hmm.
this is an extraordinary opportunity for growth, for new for a new way to continue to advance, and that false binary is becoming, I think, quite apparent.
I really appreciated the documentary because it was a fascinating look at the origin story, really, of the intersection of the environment and politics. The White House Effect is now on Netflix. Bonni, Jon, and Pedro, thank you so much for joining me. You're welcome back anytime.
Thank you, Brittany. We really appreciate it.